Dear listener, a Jacob Gray Uncanny, Silver Mirror. If it would stop raining, would we finish this section of pipeline by now? George complained. He stepped out of the cab of his digger and stared disapprovingly at the excavations. His colleague John stepped from the back of a van. He pulled up the collar of his fluorescent jacket. It's this stinking muck we're working in. I think we'll need to hand dig the remainder. George grimaced. He nodded his agreement. Where's that lazy Craig? Is he sitting in the van? The men tapped at the passenger window of the van and a sulky-faced youth stared back. He slowly got out of the van and stood glowering at the ground. Well, this is your chance to shine. We're all hand-digging the last part of this, so get the shovels and barrow, George laughed. The men were working on the narrow road outside St. John's Tower in Ayr, digging for a section of water pipe. The excavation was proving difficult, with the pipe being buried far deeper than expected. Then there was the rain. As they dug deeper, the soil became heavier and stonier and less free-draining. Clang! George had struck something with his shovel. That can't be the pipe over here, he complained. The men turned to examine what he had struck. They could make out the corner of a metal case. Is that lead? John asked. It's decorated, see, George said as he rubbed the sticky clay from the surface of the case. After some time examining the exposed metal case, George hastily dug away more of the clay. They had exposed the side and top of a long decorated metal box. It was a strange decorated case, and it was wedged in place with a large slab of stone on top of it. George, you found a coffin, John whispered, and he took off his safety helmet and searched for his glasses. Yeah, we have. Must be ancient. Part of that tower. We'll need to phone the office and see what to do about it all. I want to get a picture on my phone, Craig said as he tried to push in front. It's got inscriptions. I think they're in French. John rubbed the rain off of his glasses and took another look. What's rain? Rain is the stuff pouring out the sky. Does this mean we can stop digging? Craig asked. Not rain. Renee. That's French for Queen. Well, it looks fancy enough for that. George, you might well become famous over this. George shook his head. I knew there was something wrong with this dig. Far too deep for that pipe. Craig stepped back from the other two and stared at the part exposed top of the metal coffin. Could there no be diamonds and stuff in there, like a crown and treasure? He asked excitedly. The two men shook their heads wearily. They indicated to Craig to climb out the excavation, and they followed. Although it was March, the rain was slightly sleety and quite continuous. The clouds were low and grey and were pushed across the sky by a cold, keen wind. The men were glad to get into the relative warmth of their van. George began to make a series of phone calls, and the men opened flasks of tea and some packets of biscuits. I'm away to get another can of ginger, Craig said. Just you stay here with the van. You are caked in mud, and not fit to step in a shop door, John complained. Craig moaned. Listen, I'll go in the back of the van and change out my rigger boots and change my coat. George indicated for silence as he talked on his mobile phone. He waved his hand at Craig to leave. How can they not want to take a look in the coffin for treasure? Craig thought to himself. He stood in the back of the van and looked at the tools around him. He picked up a long, heavy metal pinch bar. This should do it, he whispered to himself. Slowly he stepped out the back of the van, being careful not to make a sound. He looked at the cab where his colleagues were, but the windows were covered in condensation and they couldn't see him. Excellent. Craig silently returned to the excavation and stared down the muddy pit, the base of which was filled with rainwater. He gently lowered himself down and stood looking at the metal coffin. It was exposed along its length and part of the lid, but there was a slab of stone that held it fast in the side of the pit. Craig knew he could prise it out with a pinch bar. It took all his strength to push against the coffin. The sticky clay soil seemed reluctant to release it. He moved the pinch bar to the slab and pushed at it. With a great slurp, the slab that lay on the coffin fell into the base of the pit. It was a crudely shaped stone cross, and in moving it so roughly it had split in half. Craig struggled to lift his feet in the swamp of water and clay at the foot of the pit. He examined the metal coffin. He could pull it out and then open it. Again he yielded the pinch bar with little care and attacked the coffin so as to dislodge it from its resting place. Then the heavy clay gave up the metal coffin and it slid out on top of the broken cross. Craig stood back. He was pleased, and he wiped the lid of the coffin and stared at its inscriptions. Craig rummaged in his pocket for a chisel he had also lifted, and he began to try and open the metal lid. It was stuck tight. Perhaps it was corroded shut. He noticed that he had scored and damaged the metal coffin. What did it matter? There was meant to be a queen inside, and by his logic she'd be lying wreathed in fabulous gems. Would you just bloody open? He shouted and knelt beside the box and struck the lid with a chisel. Ah! The lid of the metal coffin was flung open from inside. A white arm was outstretched, and the inhabitant of the coffin shrieked loudly with temper. Craig could not move. He remained kneeling by the coffin and stared transfixed with fear. All the coldness of the day meant nothing to the numbing terror that now filled his body. A white-faced lady, dressed in a crimson gown with a white ruff, suddenly sat upright. Her eyes were shut tight, but her mouth was open and screaming. Her face was terrifying to behold, a dead white mask with a gaping mouth. Her sound was the vocalization of hell itself. The monstrous woman in the coffin opened her eyes. There was nothing but blackness in them. With the quickness of a striking cobra, she turned to Craig and bit into his neck. There was screaming from within the excavation, for Craig did not die well. Down in that muddy pit, a purple queen was newly awoken, and she broke her long fast in the blood of Craig.